What we're going to do in this exercise is take a look at exporting a couple of props to an FBX file that we can import into Atelier so that we can do some cloth simulation on the props. So, prep work for our props, all we need to do is make sure that our objects are aligned to the center of the grid, because that's where they will appear in Atelier. One thing we could also do to ensure that they are positioned on the vertical is recenter or reposition the origin so that it's at grid center. So with our object selected, we're just going to reposition the cursor and then use that as our guide. So we just want to go into the View tab, 3D cursor, XYZ, just make sure that's at 0, 0, 0. And then with both of our objects selected, Object, Set Origin, Origin to 3D cursor. So doing this just ensures that our objects are correctly positioned relative to Atelier's ground plane. So with that in place, we don't necessarily need to do anything else, although these objects do actually have materials assigned that are UV unwrapped. We don't necessarily have to do that in order to get these objects into Atelier, because all we're doing is using these objects as essentially proxies to be able to do some cloth simulation. So materials and UV maps are not strictly necessary for props. So with that done, all we need to do then is File, Export, and then choose an option, FBX, GLB or GLTF, or Object. Those are all supported by Atelier, so we can use any one of those. In this case, we'll just go with FBX. Save the file. Bed plus mattress. We want to include the selected objects because we are only exporting those selected elements. Everything else is okay there. Everything else is okay here. Geometry, that's okay. Armature, that's okay, except disable add leaf bones, and we don't need any animations baked. So that's all we need. Export FBX. That's exported our FBX that we can now import into Atelier. So in Atelier, to import, all we need to do is File, Import, and then select the option that we exported to. So we used FBX. So File, Import, FBX, find our file, bed plus mattress, select, open. An import filter will pop up where we need to set the object type to prop. That'll change the options. Everything else is okay, except we might need to alter the scaling of our object as it is brought in relative to the environment that we've exported from, which might be larger than Atelier, and in this case it is. We want 1%. This is in percent. So with that done, okay. And there is our prop. So it's ignored our object position and placed the objects relative to the grid at the midpoint. So we'll just use the widget and move that up so that we are relative to the grid or ground plane. And that is our object. So before we drop in a piece of fabric and do some cloth simulation, we need to make sure that our objects have collision enabled. So select each in turn, and in the properties editor, we want to enable collide and freeze. Select, and it should be on for both of them. So now that we've done that, all we need to do is drop in a piece of fabric So just draw out a shape and use the tools to manipulate. So I'm going to center point, rotate, that's our fabric placed, and then just simulate. Then of course we can play around with the simulation. And if we are getting caught up, what we can do is change the fabric's collision thickness. And this just gives us a little bit of relief in relation to how the fabric behaves relative to itself and the props. So we don't necessarily get it sticking so often or so aggressively to our prop. So once we're happy with what we've got, we can turn off the simulation. That'll stop the simulation. And then in the fabrics properties, so if we make sure our cloth is selected, and then in the properties editor again, we want to scroll down, miscellaneous mesh type. Right now it's triangles. So if we enable 3D mesh, we can see that it's a mesh or soup of triangles. So what we can do is select a different option and it'll calculate them as quadratic faces. Now in terms of actually making something, this is essentially all we need to do. At this point we could export this, bring this back into Blender, and then edit the UV maps and material assignments in there. So let's just save the project. Okay, and then make sure our fabric is selected, then File, Export, and make a selection. OBJ, FBX, GLTF, or GLB. These are importable into Blender, so we'll just go with FBX because that's what we used before. So bed plus sheet, that's okay, save. That'll bring up a export filter, and here all we need are the patterns, which is essentially just the fabric itself. So we can disable or deselect all props and avatars. We don't need to include those with our export. Everything else is okay, and then just okay. So with that exported, we can now import that as an FBX into Blender. So in Blender, all we need to do is import the FBX we exported. FBX FBX, find the file, there it is, bed plus sheet. Our options are okay, that's okay. Disable animation, make sure there's no armature information, and then just import FBX. So the scaling will be different relative to Blender. So we need to check in the outliner for an instance, a new object instance, which confirms that the object has been imported. So select that, and then in item, make sure we're in item, we want to check the object scale. And we can see that there's a difference. So just reset that. And there is our imported bedsheet. So again, materials, rename, change the color if we want, shading workspace, add texture, image texture, and we'll just use an image that we've already got assigned to this project. So that's our material. So next, UV editing. The UVs for this will be absolutely massive. So we just need to rescale this relative to, let's do this relative to the 2D cursor. So 2D cursor, press the S key and just scale this down. Might need to do this a couple of times because it's very big. But we can see our image being mapped to our mesh in the 3D view. Drop that in place. And for this, we can squash it down a little bit. Make sure it uses up as much of our space, and that is our image mapped to our fabric. So that's using Blender to create our prop, which we've imported into Atelier for some fabric simulation, which we then exported back out of Atelier and into Blender. So this is how we can use Blender and Atelier for some prop-based fabric creation.